When I was in college, I shared a small off-campus apartment with my best friend Jamie. We were both a little odd, preferring quiet nights and weird adventures over the usual party scene. One cold October night, we decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. It was past 2 a.m. and the streets were silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. We weren't drunk or anything, just bored and restless, looking for something to do. As we wandered past a stretch of dimly lit shops, we saw a dog lying in the gutter. It was a large black dog, its fur matted and dull, its body was stiff, if the way animals get after death. There was a dark greasy smear under its head, and it didn't take much imagination to guess it had been hit by a car. Jamie knelt beside it for a moment, shaking his head. "Poor thing," he muttered. We didn't stay long. The sight was unsettling, and there was nothing we could do. We kept walking, eventually reaching a small park. A few blocks away, the swing swayed slightly in the breeze, creaking softly, and the street lights cast long eerie shadows on the pav. We sat on a bench for a while, talking about nothing in particular, just enjoying the quiet. After about an hour, we decided to head back the way we came. As we approached the stretch of road where we had seen the dog, a car passed by, its headlights cutting through the darkness. That's when we saw it again, the same black dog, alive, crossing the street away from us. It moved slowly, almost limping, its shadow stretching unnaturally long under the street light. Jamie froze mid-step. "Did you see that?" I nodded, my mouth dry. We hurried back to the spot where we had first seen it, expecting to find the body still there, but the gutter was empty. The greasy smear remained dark and glistening, but the dog was gone. We didn't say much as we walked back to our apartment. The air felt heavier, like something unseen was watching us. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself we must have been mistaken. Maybe the dog hadn't been dead after all. Maybe it had been stunned and somehow managed to get up and walk away, but it didn't make sense. Its body had been stiff, it wasn't breathing. That was only the beginning. A few nights later, Jamie was out with a friend and I was alone in the apartment trying to study. The building was old with thin walls and creaky floors, so I was used to hearing strange noises, but that night it felt different. I kept hearing faint scratching at the window, like claws dragging against the glass. At first I thought it was the wind or maybe a tree branch, but when I looked outside there was nothing there, just the empty street dimly lit by the orange glow of the street lights. I closed the blinds and tried to ignore it, but the scratching continued, soft but persistent. It wasn't until Jamie came home that it finally stopped. "Anything weird happened while I was out?" he asked, tossing his jacket on the couch. I hesitated, then shook my head. "No, nothing." I didn't want to sound crazy, but over the next few weeks the dog started appearing more and more. Jamie and his friend were walking home from a bar one night when they swore it chased them down the street. Another time I saw it sitting under a street light across from our apartment, its eyes reflecting the light in an unnatural way. It didn't move, didn't bark, just sat there watching. We started hearing rumors too. One of our neighbors mentioned seeing a black dog roaming the area late at night. Our RA even left us a note asking to speak with us. When we knocked on her door, she led us back to our apartment without explanation. When we got there, she opened the door, looked around at the mess, pizza boxes, laundry, half-empty cups of coffee, and frowned. "There's no way you're keeping a dog in here." "Sorry, Jamie," and I exchanged a look. "We don't have a dog," he said slowly. The RA raised an eyebrow. "One of the groundskeepers said they saw a black dog in your window the other night." We didn't argue. What could we say? We just nodded, waited for her to leave, and locked the door behind her. The final straw came one night in November. Jamie and I were both in the apartment, sitting on the couch, when we heard a low guttural growl coming from somewhere just outside the window. My stomach dropped. Jamie stood up, his face pale. "Stay here." He grabbed a flashlight and headed to the window slowly. He pulled back the blinds just enough to peek outside. He froze, his body stiffening like he'd been turned to stone. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back, letting the blinds fall shut, and turned to me. "It's out there," he said, his voice shaking. "It's just standing there staring at the window." We didn't sleep that night. We kept all the lights on and stayed in the living room, jumping at every little sound. By morning the dog was gone, but the unease lingered. Jamie moved out a few weeks later, claiming he couldn't take the weirdness anymore. I stayed until the end of the semester. But I never felt comfortable in that apartment again. Back in December 2019, I was living alone in a small house on the outskirts of town. It was a quiet neighborhood, and I enjoyed the peace and solitude. My only companion was my dog Max, a loyal German Shepherd who had been with me for years. Max was my protector, my friend, and my comfort in the lonely evening. The nights that month were cold, with frost clinging to the windows. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. I often sat in the living room wrapped in a blanket watching TV to pass the time. Max had a habit of sleeping by my side, but lately he had started doing something strange. Every night around 2 a.m., Max would leave my side, go downstairs to the living room, and start barking. At first I thought he was just hearing noises from outside, maybe raccoons rummaging through garbage or stray cats prowling, but it became a pattern. Every single night at the same time he would bark at something. He never seemed scared, but he was alert, like he was warning someone or something to stay away. I tried to ignore it. Max would bark for a while and then come back to my room, curling up on his bed like nothing had happened, but the barking made me uneasy. The nights felt colder, the silence in the house heavier, and I started to dread the sound of Max's claws clicking on the wooden floor as he headed downstairs. One Friday night in cold December, I was in the living room trying to distract myself with a movie. Max was lying at my feet, his ears occasionally twitching at the sounds from the TV. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 2 a.m. Right on cue, Max stood up, his ears perked, and walked to the door of the basement. He stared at it for a moment, then let out a low growl. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I muted the TV and listened. Max started barking, loud, sharp barks that echoed through the house. He was standing near the basement door, his nose almost pressed against it. His body was tense, his tail stiff. He wasn't barking at nothing. He was focused, like he saw something I couldn't. I grabbed a flashlight from the coffee table and slowly approached the basement door. My heart was racing and my hands felt clammy. Despite the cold, the air seemed heavier, pressing down on me as I opened the door just enough to shine the flashlight down the stairs. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the cluttered basement. Old boxes, broken furniture, and a few tools were scattered around. At first I didn't see anything unusual, but then just for a moment I caught a glimpse of something, a shadow, quick and fleeting, moving behind the boxes. I froze. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an animal? Could someone have broken in? I didn't know what to do. My instincts told me to run, but this was my house. I couldn't just ignore it. Instead of going down alone, I called my friend Luke. Luke was the kind of guy who never hesitated to help, and he was braver than I could ever hope to be. When I explained what was happening, he didn't laugh or brush it off. He just said he'd be there in 10 minutes. Those 10 minutes felt like an eternity. Max stayed by the basement door, barking and growling occasionally. I sat on the couch, gripping the flashlight tightly, jumping at every little noise. When Luke arrived, he didn't waste any time. Armed with his own flashlight, he gave me a reassuring nod, and we both headed toward the basement door. Max followed us, his tail wagging slightly. Now that Luke was here, we stepped into the basement, the wooden stairs creaking under our weight. The air was damp and smelled of mildew. The flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing nothing but old junk. But as we moved closer to the corner behind a stack of boxes, we found him, a man. He was crouched on the floor, his arms wrapped around his knees, trembling. He looked thin, his clothes tattered and dirty. When our lights hit him, he flinched and held up his hands like he was afraid we'd hurt him. "Please," he said, his voice shaking, "don't call the police. I'm sorry, I'll leave." Luke and I exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. The man started crying, his words spilling out in a desperate rush. He told us he'd been living in the basement for weeks. He wasn't a criminal, he said. He was just homeless. His wife had died earlier that year and he'd lost everything, his home, his job, his hope. One cold night he found my front door ajar and decided to sneak in just to find a place to sleep. I didn't mean to scare you, he said. I only came out at night to get food from the kitchen. I'm sorry. His story hit me hard. I couldn't imagine the kind of pain he must have gone through. The thought of calling the police crossed my mind, but I couldn't do it. He wasn't dangerous. He was just a man at the end of his rope. I told him he didn't have to sneak around anymore, Luke, and I helped him upstairs and I gave him some food and a warm blanket. He ate like he hadn't seen a meal in days. He kept apologizing, saying he would leave and never come back. But I couldn't just send him back into the cold. Instead, I gave him some money and drove him to a nearby shelter where he could get help. As I dropped him off, he looked at me with tears in his eyes and thanked me over and over. That night I returned home exhausted but relieved. Max curled up at my feet as I sat on the couch, the house finally quiet. I couldn't stop thinking about the man and how easily our lives could fall apart. Since that night I always double-check my doors before bed. But more than that, I've tried to hold on to a little more compassion. Sometimes people just need a little help to find their way again. This happened to me when I was about 12. My sister had this dog, a young Jack Russell, and since she was over at a friend's house, I figured I'd take him for a walk. It was around 8 p.m. in early May and it was still light out, but it would be dark soon. I walked around the corner towards the local park. The dog tugged at his leash and I made my way up the path and saw something odd. At first I thought it was a bird. It looked a bit like a partridge, but it had a reddish-brown coloring and a greenish neck. I don't know why, but something about it made me curious. I was just a kid, so I decided to run after it. At first it didn't move, just stood there, but when I got closer it darted into the bushes. I hesitated for a moment, but being 12 I was determined to see what it was. I pushed through the bushes trying to follow the bird, but the thorns sh at my skin and clothes. The dog, who was still just a puppy, was pulling. Still I had to hold him back because I was afraid that he might get stuck or hurt in the thorns. After a while I gave up on the bird and started heading towards a nearby field. That's when I started hearing strange noises from the bushes, not the usual black crow or chicky noises, but something else. It sounded like a bird, but not a bird that I had heard before. It was high-pitched, almost a whistle. I thought someone was messing around and assumed it to be some kind of a prank. I'd heard people using those foam whistle things to mimic bird calls, so I figured that's all it was. But then the noise changed. It wasn't bird sounds anymore, and it had changed to monkey noises. Now the way the noise shifted, it was unmistakably a human trying to sound like a monkey, and I didn't live in an area where wild monkeys were a thing. I stopped walking for a moment and looked around, but all I could see were bushes. I started to move towards the park. The dog was tugging harder now, as if it could sense something was wrong. That's when I noticed somebody standing in the bushes, partially hidden. They were wearing a blue coat and I could barely make out his face, but there was something about the way he stood there just watching me that made me freeze. I couldn't tell if it was a man or someone else, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I thought I might have imagined it, so I told myself to calm down and I kept walking. But the dog was acting weird. He started tugging harder and whining and barking, but not his usual playful bark. It was frantic, almost desperate. I took his collar to try to calm him down, but he bit at it like he was trying to get away from me, which was unlike him. When I let go of the leash for a second, he lunged at me, trying to bite my hand. Not a playful nip, but like he was genuinely trying to hurt me. It didn't break my skin, but it scared me. I don't know what was going on with him, but it felt wrong at that point. I was freaked out enough that I decided it was time to leave. I started walking quickly towards the path that led out of the park, the dog pulling me faster just as I turned back to head for the exit. I looked over my shoulder and I saw the person in the blue coat again behind me. I began speed walking towards the exit of the park, but that's when I saw another person coming towards me from the other side of the park. He was wearing a bright red coat and he was moving fast, way too fast for someone just out for a walk. I didn't think I just ran. I ran as fast as I could, having to find an exit through the wooded tree area of the park since the other people were blocking my path. I didn't stop until I was safely at my back door. When I got inside, I locked the door and ran up from my bedroom. I was shaking by then, but I felt a little safer in the house. I needed to make sure I was okay, so I peeked out of my window just to see if anybody was out there. When I looked out of the window, I saw the people in the red and blue coat walking down the street together. Now they were scanning yards and staring for long periods of time into people's windows and backyards as they walked by. I think they were looking to see where I lived, but thankfully I slipped in through the back door and they had no idea which house I lived in. I shut the curtain to my room and I didn't dare look outside again, as they'd be out in front of my house soon. I've never felt that scared again, and I never went back to that park alone after dark.